bit more unique. And we have two investment themes that we focus on, right? The first is on energy transition. A lot of us do come from the energy sector, right? So we spend a lot of time actually also on renewables investments, into solar, into wind farms, into battery storage. Seraya is also doing EV charging, which is a personal focus of mine here at Seraya Partners. But the other theme that we also do is what we call digital infrastructure, right? Which I mentioned earlier on. And it's very interesting that these two teams are coming together, like I mentioned earlier on. And so for what we do on the data center world, right, and the data center investments is, our mission is actually to develop, own, and operate very green, the most greenest possible data centers, right? Making sure that data centers, are as sustainable as possible. And we think that that's actually also, from a business standpoint, also a key differentiation in the market, right? We see a lot of our peers, they are big companies operating lots and lots of data centers, and they're good at what they do. But a lot of what they do is just also doing things that has been done for the past 5 to 10 years in the data center business, just adding more and more, real estate space, data centers, adding more and more power, for data centers, building more and more facilities. I think where we as an industry in the data center need to become more cognizant of our impact. And this is where Seraya is trying to be different, trying to do things a little bit more uniquely or different. We focus more on how we get our data centers to be very, very energy efficient. We focus on how we can procure better and cleaner power for our data centers. I think this is why we position ourselves as developers of green data centers. So for one, if we look at somewhere like Singapore, it's a bit challenging to procure green power. So there's really not a lot of green power in Singapore. We don't have a good wind resource, right? So that's not a possible generation for Singapore. We have limited land. So yes, I think Singapore tries its best, right, to deploy as much solar as possible. But really, out of that limited, solar availability that we have in Singapore, we think currently it's only about 500 plus megawatts, right? We have a goal to get to 2 gigawatts, but really that is just a very small proportion of the overall energy mix in Singapore. But we try to, we try to do our best, right, in terms of procuring green energy, right, for our data center. I think where you hear, I think a lot of government initiatives that's recently launched, right, in Singapore International Week this year, right, or end of October, this really moved towards hydrogen. And that's actually where Seraya Partners and Ambient DC were looking very, very closely, working with industrial partners on how can we actually participate in the hydrogen value chain, right? Looking at all the opportunities that we can also become more responsible by saying, yes, we are prepared to potentially pay more, right, to source for green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, right, to power our data centers. And actually, that's one initiative we're looking very, very closely on today. So that's more on how we actually try to procure as much green energy as we can possibly, particularly in Singapore, within the confines of how limited it is to get. That's one strategy. Second strategy is on energy efficiency. And it's really where I think most people know, right? If you use your mobile phone for too long, for example, right, it gets very hot, right? Because chips generate a lot of right? So the biggest problem in any data centers is always about how do you cool, right? How do you cool your chips? And how do you do so efficiently, right? If you take an analogy, if you put your mobile phone in just an aircon room, right? Trying to use your aircon room to cool your chips, that's not very, very efficient, right? And so we are looking at different technologies, right, that we can try to bring down, the industry jargon is what we call PUE, right? Power utilization efficiency, right? And how every data center operator today, right, all are trying to minimize our PUE such that the majority of the power that we have is actually trying to be used as much as possible for the cooling of our facilities, right? But cooling for the chips rather than cooling of the temperature around you. And so we have been exploring a lot of technologies today, right? A lot of the technologies that you find today is different forms of indirect evaporative cooling. Very, very interesting terms that I honestly had not encountered, much earlier on in my career. And other things that we're looking at, obviously exploring, is direct chip cooling, right? So this is really, or even what they call immersive cooling of the chips directly in some kind of particular special liquids. So all of this is very, very cutting edge technology today, all of which we're trying to apply, right, in future centers that we're building one right now in Korea, that we're looking at indirect evaporative cooling as one technology, and certainly also working with our customers, right? Because our customers are the ones that bring a lot of their server racks, their chips to our co-location facilities, right? So working with them, can we do to explore? And what we try to be responsible is that we try to build with a capacity that it's ready, for ready for direct chip cooling or liquid immersion cooling for our chips. So a lot of this is try to make sure that our data centers are ready when our customers are ready, right, to the adoption for our new technologies. I would say that the talent market for data centers, I would say the general skill set is reasonably deep in places like Singapore, in places like South Korea. It's reasonably deep, right? And also certainly places like Japan. These are places where you get good base of technology skill sets very, very readily available, right? So quite deep and very experienced. Where I think the challenges are evolving is in terms of also the less so-called technology-focused parts, but really at the heart is technology. It's on the cooling technologies that we have to apply going forward. Those are very mechanical and engineering skill sets, right? It's a typical M&E skill sets that you see more in the real estate side of the world, but very, very specialized type of real estate, right? How do you cool big buildings, right? In a very efficient manner, right? You have a lot of chiller plants, you have to, and how do you operate those chiller plants more efficiently, or different types of technologies, right? And you run more piping within the buildings, for example. So there's mechanical engineering, there's electrical components, right? A lot of these actually comes into play. I think that these talent, I think will be highly sought after, I think in the years to come, because these are very core challenges, I think, on what's on top of everybody's mind. Right? How do we become more efficient in running effectively data building going forward? I think that is actually a very, very, I think it will be a very exciting space, particularly for people who are mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, because you've got to think both quite early on, right, on how do you design buildings for that, right? How do you design buildings to become energy efficiency? How do you design buildings to not, particularly in our environment, like in Singapore, so that you're not affected by the heat outside, right? You can keep and maintain cooling, right, within maintain the coolness, right, within our buildings in spite of the heat, outside. And so all of these skill sets, I think, will become, I think, very, very attractive and very, very much needed, in these years to come, because data is more than just about technology now, right? It's really about how do you run, all these very, very cutting edge buildings, right, going forward. Sure. I think the sustainability sector is a very big one, right? Very, very, very big to think about. Yeah. So for us here at Seraya, I think we're very focused on things on related to renewables generation, such as solar, such as wind, and also such as battery storage, which we think is coming up, right? Battery storage is sort of a link, right, to some of the intermittency problems, right, with solar, right? No sun, no power, or no wind, no power, and that's actually that's actually a huge problem, right, in the generation business for us. And I think linked to that also, we are also trying to address a lot of issues in the supply chain of renewable energy generation. So at Seraya Partners, another sector that we're closely looking at is actually the vessels for offshore wind farms, right? There is a huge shortage, right, for a lot of these vessels that's actually serving these offshore wind farms, and actually we need to actually find enough vessels, right, today to help service all these offshore wind farms as it's growing very, very rapidly throughout the world and also including in Asia as well. And so we are providing all these vessels primarily through an ownership and leasing of these vessels to the top developers, to the top operators, engineering companies, and O&M companies on the offshore wind farms. So that's another segment that we're looking at. And of course, I think for us, on the digital infrastructure side, we're trying to marry both for us. Sustainability, what we do on the energy transition side, we're also trying to marry with digital infrastructure, right, such as data centers. Of course, we are also looking beyond just digital infrastructure at data centers on the digital infrastructure side, right? That really could encompass everything from, fiber, to telecom towers, all of which, which we are looking at. So I think the sustainability world is really big, right? It means a lot of things and can mean a lot of things. We try to focus on sort of these aspects that we have today. And I think that, even in and of itself, those are very, very big markets to address. I think we have certainly, know that there are other peers. I think we are looking at a lot of different other segments. I think sustainability could mean even agriculture or a lot of our other peers. Currently not our focus, but certainly, throwing this out as maybe a wild card, right, for everybody to think about, because that's another huge sector that's being talked a lot about these days. Just to share some context, right? I think Singapore, we are in a very unique position because we are a small island city, very, very urban dense. But at the same time, we host one of the largest trade rates for data centers being sited in Singapore. Part of the problem that we face in the DC industry here in Singapore is that power is precious. It's a precious resource, right? And we have limited power resources, but yet each data center takes up so much power usage within, within the island city, right? That takes up so much of the usage of that. So naturally, we have to become more strategic and smart, right, about it if we want to also become more sustainable, right, in our power usage. So interestingly, Singapore is now actually a bit like a test bed, right? Because the Singapore government actually did a moratorium, right, to actually literally stop new data center constructions by limiting the allocation of power to data center. If you want to put up new data centers, right, in Singapore, you can't. And the Singapore government had called the moratorium for almost 1.5 years, almost 2 years, only until this year, right? The Singapore government has called for a data center call for applications, DCCFA, to actually ask the industry to give proposals for new data centers to be built, right? They are more green, more energy efficient, and at the same time also have more economic value add to the country. So sometimes if you look at a data center, right, we have a data center investment here in Singapore. It's a 7.7 megawatt IT load data center in the Thomson area of Singapore, northeastern part of Singapore. It's a nice big facility and hires about 20 people, right? And use up about 12.5 megawatts of power, right? And this is with this kind of equation, right, that the Singapore government is looking at. Wow, this takes up land, takes up so much power, and only hires 20 people, right? Doesn't seem like a very, very great economic proposition. And so the Singapore government had called for this moratorium, but only recently opened up, right, to say they are looking for proposals of how to address these three issues, right? Become more power efficient, right? Use more green power and have more strategic value, right, to Singapore as a country. So what Seraya Partners we did is, we are part of a consortium. We are participating in this data center call for applications, right, to actually propose how we think the next generation of data centers will look like, right? Use of more power, right? Inclusive the use of hydrogen to power the data centers, right? Using a more cutting edge cooling technologies to our data centers, and also looking at a lot of initiatives in Singapore, right, to promote actually cooling technologies and promote actually use of hydrogen, right, as part of wider economies of Singapore. I think all of this is happening in this small island, right, in Singapore. And we already see this trend in many parts of the world, for data center industries particularly, where governments are actually slowing down the rollout of data centers, right? Because it has all the same problems and challenges, right, for the regions, right? In Amsterdam, we're seeing it. In Ireland, we're seeing it. In Korea, we're seeing it. There's all these limitations. But what's interesting in doing it all here, right? This little petri dish, right, that Singapore is, to learn, right, and to build out. And I think with all these things that we're doing, I think potentially we can take a lot of what's happening here, right, particularly for us as Seraya here, to actually apply it to the region. Because I think all of these considerations will come, right, as everybody's asking the same questions. How do we make data centers more green, more efficient? And all these learnings that we for ourselves, Seraya, is taking here in Singapore, I think we have a unique position here in Singapore to learn. And hopefully, I think this is what will help, right, grow our data center industry with a more sustainable angle going forward. I think there are three areas I think you can sort of think about your so-called career skills. The first box I would think are like functional skills. Functional skills meaning, marketing skills, meaning accounting skills, or finance skills, right? Those are, or, doing presentation skills, right? These are functional skills to me, right? So that is one set of box to always think about in every career pivot. I think the second segment are what I call industry skills, right? Those are your knowledge in the energy industry, your knowledge in maybe the automotive industry, or your knowledge in maybe, it can be anything, right? I mean, food industry, right? Industry segments. So that's second box. I think the third box you can look at actually is your geographical skills. Do you know how to do business in China? Do you know how to do business in Indonesia, right? Or do you know how to do business in USA, right? Or in Japan, or your language skills, right, to do business. So I think those are three groups of boxes or skills that you can think about starting off when you think about every pivot. And I would say that as you pivot, try not to change more than two of those boxes. So I think if you want to pivot, then think hard. And I think for most people, talking about pivot means probably pivoting from one industry to another. So maybe you have to think about, is there any linkages, right, between one industry to another? For example, I would say that a lot of times people in the real estate space, right, may be able to quite easily pivot to many parts of the data center space, for example, because there are a lot of real estate elements, right, and know-how that's actually in data centers. So that's kind of one pivot. Or you're actually a software person, right? You do a lot of software, and maybe there's also a way for you to be able to pivot to, let's say you want to do data centers, right? Because there's a lot of software aspects to the data center, to do every data center as well. You need to do, or you're just an electrical engineer, right? Again, there's a lot of electrical components. So I think it's sort of thinking about where the commonalities are. So one, and second, certainly when you pivot, obviously try to pivot, into job roles where it plays immediately to your functional strength, right? You used to do a lot of marketing, right? In your old industry, you want to come to another new industry, play up that, right? Play up your market skills. Or you are Excel wizard. You're really, really good at Excel. You can do financial models that are like, 50 pages long and, 20 columns, 50 columns long, right? If you're Excel wizard, then play, those are skills you want to put on. So I think every career pivot, look for those commonalities. Yeah. So I think in terms of sustainable operations, I think comes on a few fronts, right? For one, a lot of it actually has to come down to your original design, right, for the data centers.
So our data centers do actually use a lot of water for cooling. So one of the key things that we had to do, and at least originally when we designed this, is to make sure that we actually have as efficient as also as water as possible, right? So actually our water is actually in a closed loop system. We actually don't lose the water. So therefore we are not entirely dependent on having to source new sources of water, right, to come in. So I think that's one aspect. I think other aspects that we try to do in terms of trying to ensure that we're more sustainable is, obviously we look to try to reduce a lot of our wastage, look to reduce in terms of paper, in terms of electronics. So in some ways, it could be surprising for some people to hear, we don't actually have to deal with a lot of electronic waste at the data center. Primarily because as a co-location provider, we're actually providing the physical, right, the core and shell, as well as the cooling portions. And we don't actually we don't have to be responsible directly for the electronics, right, that goes directly inside the racks, which is what our customers bring in. So we don't directly have to deal with, let's say, if the equipment needs to be disposed, electronic waste, how do we do it? But we have actually done previous tie-ups where it was needed that, we can actually help our customers if they need to remove, their electronic waste, right? So that it goes to the right recyclers, right? They're actually, dealt with properly, right? And because all of this is also in fairly large quantities, right? So it has to be done, properly. And again, in the Singapore context, there are regulations which you just can't dump the electronic waste anywhere, right, into the trash. Yeah. So that's another second measure. And I think the third measure that we're trying to do more is also trying to use more green power. And that goes back to the original what I mentioned, what I think we talked about earlier on. But that's a challenging step because it's just easy to get green power in Singapore via the grid, simply because it's just difficult to source for that kind of generation. I think we try to do what we can, particularly for existing facilities that we have. A lot of what needs to be done in a way has to be done, has to be done in advance. In other words, you have to plan for some of this. And that helps as we go from generation to generation upgrades of how we think about design of data centers. That's where we can get better, right? So existing data centers, there's sometimes a limit of how much we can really do. But at the heart of it is you have to think about it from a design perspective at the very start for future data centers.